Grace had scrubbed those floors 100 times, invisible to wealthy guests. Tonight she served champagne to people who'd never know her name. Then a millionaire's cruel dare shattered everything she'd learned about staying small. The Riverside Country Club sparkled like a jewel box that evening. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the ballroom's vaulted ceiling, each facet catching fire as the orchestra tuned their instruments. Grace Martinez moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent 15 years serving people who never quite saw her. She balanced a tray of champagne flutes with steady hands, weaving between clusters of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. The glasses clinked softly, a delicate sound barely audible beneath the murmur of wealthy conversations. Grace knew this ballroom better than most of the guests. She'd polished these marble floors on her hands and knees more times than she could count. She'd wiped fingerprints from these gilt-framed mirrors. She'd arranged flowers in the tall vases that now overflowed with orchids and roses. But tonight, like every gala night, she was simply part of the scenery. "Excuse me," a woman in emerald silk said, plucking a glass from Grace's tray without meeting her eyes. The woman turned back to her companion, laughing at some private joke. Grace moved on. The spring fundraiser for the Riverside Arts Foundation always drew the city's elite. Grace recognized faces from magazine covers and newspaper society pages. Tech entrepreneurs, real estate developers, politicians with practiced smiles. They came to see and be seen, to write checks that would earn them plaques on gallery walls, to dance under chandeliers worth more than her annual salary. She didn't resent them. Not really. This was simply how the world worked. They lived in one realm, she in another, and the two rarely intersected except in moments like these, her hands offering, theirs taking. Grace caught her reflection in one of those gilt mirrors as she passed. Her server's uniform was crisp and black, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. At 47, she saw lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a decade ago. Lines from squinting at bus schedules in morning darkness. From smiling at customers who treated her like furniture. From staying up late to help Elena with college applications. Though God knew how they'd afford tuition, even if her daughter got in. "Another round for our table." The request came from a barrel-chested man with silver hair and a voice accustomed to being obeyed. Grace nodded, already moving toward the bar. The evening progressed in familiar rhythms. Grace refilled glasses, cleared plates, answered questions about the menu with a pleasant smile. The orchestra had started playing, a waltz that sent couples swirling onto the parquet dance floor. She watched them glide past, their movements effortless and elegant, born from years of cotillion classes and country club summers. "Watch yourself." The sharp whisper came from Miguel, another server, as Grace nearly collided with him near the kitchen doors. His eyes cut toward a corner table where 3 men sat, their posture radiating importance. "That's Christopher Blackwell, venture capitalist. Tipped $5 last year on a $3,000 tab. Acts like he owns the place because his family donated the East Wing." Grace's gaze flickered toward the table. Christopher Blackwell looked to be in his mid-40s, with the kind of sharp features that photographed well. His tuxedo fit like it had been sewn directly onto his body. He leaned back in his chair, with the ease of someone who'd never questioned his right to any space he occupied. The 2 men with him laughed at something he'd said, their body language deferential despite their own obvious wealth. Grace. The catering manager, Susan, appeared at her elbow. "Table 12 needs attention, and smile more. These people are paying for an experience." Grace swallowed the retort that rose in her throat. Susan had never worked the floor, never felt the particular exhaustion that came from being both essential and invisible. But Susan signed the paychecks, so Grace nodded and adjusted her expression into something appropriately pleasant. Table 12 turned out to be a group of women in their 60s, dripping with jewelry that caught the light with every gesture. They wanted fresh napkins. More water, but not too cold. Was the salmon sustainably sourced? Grace answered each question with patience she'd learned to manufacture, her feet aching in the sensible black shoes that were already wearing through at the heels. The orchestra transitioned into something jazzy. The dance floor filled. Grace noticed the crowd parting slightly around Christopher Blackwell as he stood, buttoning his jacket with practiced precision. He said something to his companions that made them laugh, then began moving through the ballroom with the confidence of someone who expected the seas to part before him. Champagne. He snapped his fingers at Grace without looking at her. She'd been reaching for an empty plate. She straightened, her jaw tightening for just a moment before she smoothed her expression. "Of course, sir. Right away. Make it quick. I'm meeting the mayor in 5 minutes, and I don't like to wait." Grace turned toward the bar, her tray balanced against her hip. Behind her, she heard Christopher's voice carrying across the ballroom. "Yes, the Riverside project should break ground next month. We're raising that whole block on 5th Street. Absolute eyesore. Laundromats and corner stores. We'll put up something befitting the neighborhood's real potential." 5th Street. Grace's steps faltered for just a heartbeat. Elena's school was on 5th Street. The library where they spent Saturday afternoons was on 5th Street. The corner bodega where Mrs. Chen always saved the day-old bread for them was on 5th Street. She collected the champagne, the expensive kind, the bottles they kept on ice in the back, and returned to find Christopher holding court near the edge of the dance floor. A semicircle of admirers had gathered, their faces attentive. Grace approached carefully, holding the tray at the proper height. "Your champagne, sir." Christopher took the glass without acknowledgement, still mid-sentence about projected returns and market transformation. Grace began to step back, but his companion, a younger man with slicked back hair, gestured for another glass. She obliged, waiting in that particular limbo of service staff everywhere. Present but not present, needed but not seen. "The thing about redevelopment," Christopher was saying, swirling his champagne with casual expertise, "is that sentiment has no place in business. Yes, there are people living in those buildings, working in those shops. But the market has decided that space is more valuable as luxury condos and boutique retail. It's just economics." A few heads nodded. Someone murmured agreement. Grace felt something hot and sharp in her chest. Not quite anger, not quite sorrow. Something in between. "Progress requires difficult decisions," Christopher continued. "You can't let nostalgia or misplaced compassion slow down development. The people in those buildings, they'll find somewhere else to go. They always do." Grace's hand trembled slightly. The remaining champagne flutes clinked together. The sound drew Christopher's attention for the first time. His eyes focused on her, really seeing her, and something flickered across his face. Amusement, perhaps, or disdain. "Still here?" He raised an eyebrow. "Don't you have tables to clear?" "Yes, sir." Her voice came out steady. "My apologies." She turned to go, but his voice followed her. "Wait." Grace stopped, her shoulders tensing. Behind her, she heard the shift in the crowd's attention, the way conversations dimmed when someone like Christopher Blackwell decided to put on a show. "You look tired," he said, his tone carrying that particular blend of false concern and genuine condescension that wealthy people sometimes wielded like a weapon. "How long have you been working tonight?" "Since 4 o'clock, sir." 4 o'clock, he said it loud enough for the growing audience. 8 hours on your feet, that's dedication. What do you do here, besides serve champagne? Grace felt every eye on her now. The orchestra played on, but the dancers near them had slowed, curiosity pulling their attention. "I'm part of the catering staff. I also work housekeeping during the day." "Housekeeping and catering." Christopher's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A hard worker. I admire that. You know what else I admire? Versatility, adaptability." He gestured toward the dance floor with his champagne glass. "Can you dance?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Silence rippled outward. Grace met his gaze directly for the first time that evening. "I'm working, sir." "Oh, I'm not suggesting you abandon your duties." His voice carried across the ballroom now, drawing more onlookers. "I'm simply curious. These galas, they're full of dancing, music, culture. The people who make them possible, the staff, the workers, they're surrounded by all this beauty. But do they ever get to participate? It seems almost cruel, doesn't it?" A woman in a pearl necklace laughed uncomfortably. Others shifted, unsure where Christopher was going with this. "I'll tell you what," Christopher said, his voice taking on that theatrical quality of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "I'm feeling generous tonight. It's a fundraiser, after all. We're all supposed to be giving back, aren't we?" He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out his wallet with practiced flair. "I'll give you $500. He extracted several bills. "If you put down that tray and dance, Right here. Right now. Show us what you've got." The silence deepened. Grace felt it pressing against her skin, hot and heavy. She saw Susan across the room, her eyes wide with alarm. She saw Miguel near the kitchen doors, his face carefully blank. She saw the crowd of wealthy faces, some shocked, some intrigued, some already pulling out their phones. $500, more than a week's wages. Elena's textbooks for next semester, the rent extension she desperately needed. But in Christopher Blackwell's eyes, she saw something else. Not generosity, not kindness. He was amusing himself at her expense, turning her struggle into his entertainment. To him, she wasn't a person with a name and a daughter and dreams that had been deferred so long they'd started to fade. She was a curiosity, a prop in his performance of magnanimity. Grace started, her voice catching. "Come on," Christopher pressed, holding out the bills like a dare. $500, unless you can't dance? Maybe you people don't learn things like that. Too busy working, right? The words hung in the crystal-lit air. Grace felt something shift inside her, some long-dormant thing stirring beneath years of swallowed pride and bent backs and yes-sirs and thank-yous for scraps. She looked at the money in his hand, then at his face, then at the crowd of people who were already recording this moment, already deciding what story they'd tell about the desperate waitress and the generous millionaire. Grace set her tray down on the nearest table with a soft click. $500, she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness. For one dance. Christopher's smile widened, victorious. That's the spirit. But Grace wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking past him, toward the orchestra, toward the dance floor where polished shoes glided across parquet her hands had buffed to a shine. She was thinking about her grandmother, who'd taught her to dance in a kitchen that smelled like arroz con pollo and hope. She was thinking about Elena, who needed to see that her mother didn't break, no matter how hard the world pushed. She was thinking about what happened when you made the mistake of thinking someone was invisible. The orchestra leader, sensing something electric in the air, lifted his baton. The music swelled, a tango, passionate and defiant. Grace stepped onto the dance floor, and Christopher Blackwell had absolutely no idea what he'd just set in motion. Grace stood at the edge of the parquet floor, her server's uniform stark against silk and satin. The orchestra's tango pulsed through the ballroom, urgent, defiant. Every eye had turned toward her. Phones were raised, recording. This was supposed to be entertainment. A poor woman dancing for money. A story they could share later over cocktails. Christopher Blackwell lounged against a column, champagne glass raised in mock toast. His smile was smug, victorious. The $500 remained in his other hand. Crisp bills fanned out like playing cards, a visual reminder of the transaction he'd orchestrated. He'd bought a performance, and now he'd watch it unfold. Watch her struggle, perhaps. Watch her fail, more likely. Grace closed her eyes. She heard her grandmother's voice from decades ago, felt worn linoleum beneath her feet, smelled arroz con pollo and cheap perfume and determination. Mija, when you dance, you tell a story with your body, your heart. You dance what you cannot say. The tango's rhythm entered her bones like a memory coming home. Grace opened her eyes and began to move. The transformation wasn't gradual. There was no tentative step, no searching for the beat. Grace simply became someone else, or perhaps more fully herself than she'd been allowed to be in years. Her shoulders rolled back, spine lengthened, chin lifted with pride that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with claiming space she'd been taught not to occupy. She moved across the floor with fluid precision, her work shoes irrelevant to the elegance of her steps. The tango was a conversation between dancer and music, and Grace spoke that language fluently. Her arms carved shapes in the air, angular, dramatic, purposeful. Her hips moved with controlled sensuality. Her legs executed kicks and sweeps that required strength and absolute balance. The ballroom went silent except for the orchestra. Even conversations at distant tables faded as people turned to watch. Forks paused midway to mouths. Wine glasses hung suspended. Grace executed ochos, figure-8 steps that required rotating her hips while keeping her shoulders still, a move that looked simple but demanded years of training. The movement was hypnotic, technically demanding, and she performed it as naturally as breathing. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget, That once, she'd been magnificent at this. Near the column, Christopher's smile had frozen. His champagne glass hung suspended, forgotten. The certainty in his expression was developing cracks. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't a desperate woman humiliating herself for cash. This was something else entirely. Grace spun, hair whipping around her face, the bun loosening, dark strands escaping to frame her features. She was 47, her body marked by years of hard labor, knees that ached on cold mornings, hands roughened by cleaning solutions. But in this moment, she moved with the precision of a professional and the passion of someone who'd been waiting years for permission to remember. A woman in the crowd gasped. The sound rippled outward like a stone dropped in water. The orchestra leader, a man who'd played 1,000 country club events without ever being moved, leaned forward on his podium. His baton moved with increased energy, urgency. The musicians responded, giving Grace more passion, more complexity. They'd recognized something in her movements. This wasn't amateur enthusiasm. This was craft. This was art. Grace met the music's escalation without hesitation. She dropped into a low lunge that had people reflexively reaching out, certain she would fall. But she didn't fall. She rose with liquid grace, one leg extending behind her in a perfect line, her back arching, her arms framing her body in a shape that belonged on a stage, anywhere but this ballroom where she was supposed to be invisible. "My God," someone whispered. The words carried across the marble and crystal. More phones rose, but the quality of recording had changed. People weren't capturing a humiliating dare anymore. They were documenting something unexpected, something real. Grace could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way collective attention transformed from morbid curiosity to genuine awe. She executed rapid-fire steps that ate up the floor with sharp precision. Her feet moved so quickly they blurred, but her upper body remained collected, elegant, controlled chaos, passionate discipline. This was what separated trained dancers from enthusiasts, the ability to be both wild and precise, to let emotion drive movement without sacrificing technique. Christopher had straightened from his casual lean. The $500 crumpled in his tightening grip. His companions had stopped watching him and turned fully toward Grace. His audience had found someone more interesting. The orchestra swelled toward the tango's climax. The music built like a wave preparing to crest. Grace gave everything. She moved through a sequence that would have challenged professional dancers half her age. A combination of lunges, spins, and extensions that told a story without words. The story was about dignity, about pride that couldn't be bought, about talent that survived years of being dismissed, rendered invisible by people who thought service work meant someone had nothing else to offer. Her final sequence began with a slow, controlled spiral, her body descending toward the floor while rotating, every muscle engaged to maintain control. Halfway down, she paused, suspended in that impossible position, one leg extended, her back arched, defying gravity. The pause lasted just long enough for the crowd to hold its breath. Then Grace exploded upward into a sharp, percussive movement that matched the orchestra's dramatic chord. Her arm snapped into position, her leg extended in a perfect vertical split. She held the position, one leg pointed at the ceiling, her standing leg absolutely stable, for 2 full measures. The orchestra hit the final decisive note. Grace dropped into a deep lunge, one arm extended toward the crowd, her head thrown back, her expression fierce and proud and utterly unashamed. Sweat gleamed on her forehead. Her chest heaved, but her eyes blazed with something that had been dormant for 15 years. The silence stretched for 1 heartbeat, 2. Then the ballroom erupted. The applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, genuinely moved. The orchestra musicians clapped along, instruments forgotten. Grace remained in her final pose, chest heaving, then slowly rose and turned toward Christopher Blackwell. He stood frozen, $500 clutched in his hand. His expression had cycled through surprise and landed on irritation. The situation had escaped his control completely. Grace walked toward him with the same grace she'd brought to her dancing. The crowd parted. Every eye tracked her movement. Phones remained raised, still recording. She stopped in front of him. "I danced. $500, I believe you said." Christopher's eyes flicked to the crowd, calculating. Whatever he did next would be recorded, shared, analyzed. His reputation hung in the balance. He extended the bills, voice edged. I didn't realize the club hired professionals for catering. They didn't. Grace took the money, fingers steady. They hired someone who needed work. Someone whose dance career ended when she chose to raise a daughter alone. Someone who spent 15 years scrubbing floors you walk on without wondering who polished them. Professional dancer was who I used to be. Before life required different choices. The words carried weight. Around them the crowd shifted, expressions changing. The narrative was transforming. Where did you train? The woman in emerald silk asked, genuine curiosity replacing earlier dismissiveness. Miami City Ballet School, scholarship student. I danced with a contemporary company for 3 years before my daughter was born. Grace gestured at her uniform, the explanation complete. You gave it up? I chose something more important. My daughter needed stability, food, a home. You can't pay rent with applause. The simple truth hung in the air, uncomfortable and undeniable. Christopher cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control. Well, that was unexpected. I trust the money will be useful. But Grace didn't move. She looked at him, really looked at him. You asked if I could dance, but that wasn't really your question. You wanted to know if someone like me could do something beautiful. If someone who serves your champagne might have dreams you've never bothered to imagine. Christopher's expression hardened. The transaction is complete. You mentioned a project on 5th Street, raising buildings for luxury condos. The Riverside project. What about it? My daughter's school is on 5th Street. Has been for 10 years. Where will those children go when you demolish the building for boutique retail? Christopher's jaw tightened. There are other schools. The city has a responsibility to provide education. I have a responsibility to my investors. Other schools. Farther away. Longer commutes. Fewer resources. But those children are as invisible to you as I was 20 minutes ago. The crowd had gone silent, tense, anticipating. I identify undervalued properties and maximize their potential. That's business. How convenient that you can profit from poverty without responsibility for the people you displace. Christopher flushed. I think you're forgetting yourself. No, I'm remembering myself. The person I was before years of being told to accept crumbs from tables like yours. You gave me $500. My daughter's school registration costs $400 for 1 semester. When you've demolished the building, when rent triples, when families are pushed to the edges, what then? Then you adapt. That's how progress works. Progress. Grace looked around the ballroom, at the chandeliers, the mirrors, the champagne and designer gowns. Your wealth increasing while children lose their schools for luxury you'll never use. Watch yourself. Or what? You'll fire me? You don't employ me? Blacklist me? I'm already invisible to people like you. What can you take from me that hasn't already been taken? Before Christopher could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. That was extraordinary. Margaret Hartfield moved through the crowd, silver hair in an elegant chignon, simple black dress radiating quiet wealth. Founding member of the Riverside Arts Foundation, the woman whose philanthropy had built half the city's cultural institutions. She stopped before Grace, sharp eyes assessing. Your technique is exceptional. How long since you danced professionally? 15 years. 15 years, and you retained that skill. That's dedication. Discipline most people never develop. Margaret turned toward Christopher. Mr. Blackwell, you've underestimated the value of the people who keep this establishment running. Christopher's expression tightened. With respect, I'm not finished. This gala supports the arts, celebrates talent, regardless of where we find it. We've found quite a lot tonight. She turned back to Grace. What's your name? Grace Martinez. Grace Martinez, I believe we have more to discuss. But not here. Margaret glanced at the phones still recording. This evening has become quite the production. The dismissal was clear. The crowd dispersed, conversations erupting. Did you see those turns? Incredible. Who is she? What he said about 5th Street. Christopher stood rigid, fury beneath his mask. Grace had embarrassed him before his peers and their recording devices. Men like Christopher Blackwell didn't forget. This isn't over, he said quietly. Grace met his gaze steadily. No, I don't imagine it is. He walked away, companions trailing behind. Grace stood alone, still in her uniform, still holding $500 that felt both like too much and not nearly enough. The orchestra resumed playing. Couples drifted back to the floor. The evening attempted to return to normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Grace had stepped out of invisibility, and there was no stepping back. The question wasn't whether there would be consequences. The question was what form they would take, and whether she'd have the strength to face them. The bus ride home smelled like disinfectant and exhaustion. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching the city transform. Manicured lawns giving way to chain-link fences, boutiques replaced by corner stores behind bulletproof glass. The $500 sat folded in her pocket, somehow accusatory. Her phone buzzed constantly, notifications she didn't want to see. Grace powered it off. Whatever was happening could wait. The bus stopped at 5th Street. Grace stepped onto cracked pavement the city had promised to fix for 3 years. Chen's Market's neon sign flickered irregular shadows. Mrs. Chen looked up from her crossword puzzle, smiling. "Grace, you're home late. The gala went longer than usual." Grace grabbed milk, noting the price increase. Everything always going up except wages. "Elena came by earlier. I gave her the good apples." Mrs. Chen's expression shifted. "Grace, have you heard about development plans for this block?" Grace thought of Christopher Blackwell's voice. "The market has decided that space is more valuable as luxury condos." "We'll figure something out," Grace said, with more confidence than she felt. She climbed 3 flights, knees protesting. The hallway smelled like cumin and garlic, making her stomach growl. Elena jumped up from the kitchen table when Grace entered, phone in hand. "Mom, you won't believe this. You're everywhere." "Elena." "No, look." Elena showed her screen. The video had 2.3 million views in 4 hours. "There are dozens of videos. Everyone's trying to figure out who you are. There's a hashtag, Waitress Warrior. I probably don't have a job anymore." Elena's excitement faltered. "What? Why?" "Because I embarrassed a man who donates $250,000 a year to that club." "Mom, tell me what happened, everything." So Grace did. She told her daughter everything. About the dare, the money, the music that had awakened something dormant inside her. About the dance that pulled 15 years of suppressed identity to the surface in 3.5 minutes. About confronting Christopher in front of cameras and witnesses. About 5th Street and the 200 families whose lives he considered acceptable collateral damage for his profit margins. About Margaret Hartfield's unexpected intervention. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from excitement to understanding to something harder, older than 17. When Grace finished, Elena reached across the scarred kitchen table and took her mother's hands. "You were right to do it. All of it. I don't know that yet, Mija. I may have just made everything worse. I do know. Mom, I've watched you disappear a little bit every year, bending, shrinking, apologizing for existing in spaces where people like him think you don't belong, accepting whatever scraps they offer because you're afraid of losing even that. Tonight you reminded them, and yourself, that you're not invisible, that you matter. I am a service worker, Elena. That's reality. You're a dancer, an artist, a mother who sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities you never had. And tonight you showed them all of that." Elena's eyes were bright, fierce. "Whatever happens next, that moment was worth it. I saw the video, Mom. I saw your face. You were alive in a way I haven't seen since I was little." Grace wanted to believe her. But she'd lived long enough to know that standing up to people with power usually came with a price tag, and the bill always came due faster than you expected. Her phone, still powered off, sat on the table like an unexploded bomb. Grace reached for it, hesitated, then turned it back on. The screen immediately lit up, notifications cascading faster than she could read them. Most were from numbers she didn't recognize. Messages ranged from supportive to creepy to outright hostile. But 3 made her pause. The first was from Susan, her catering manager. "Grace, we need to talk. Come to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. Don't be late." The second was from an unknown number with formal tone. "Ms. Martinez, my name is Catherine Ross. I'm Mrs. Margaret Hartfield's personal assistant. Mrs. Hartfield would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience. Please call this number to schedule." The third was also unknown, but the message made her blood run cold. "You made a mistake tonight. People in your position should know better than to embarrass their betters in public. Actions have consequences, Ms. Martinez. You'll learn that soon enough. Elena, watching her mother's face, leaned forward. What is it? Grace showed her the messages. Elena's expression darkened as she read the third one. That's a threat. Mom, you have to report this. To who? The police? And tell them what? That I upset a rich man and now someone sent me a vaguely threatening text. Grace deleted the message, but her hand trembled slightly. They'd laugh me out of the station. Elena, people like Christopher Blackwell don't make direct threats. They have other people do it for them. Plausibly deniable. Still, we ignore it. We move forward. That's all we can do. But the words felt hollow, and from Elena's expression, her daughter didn't believe them either. They ate a late dinner. Canned soup and toast, nothing fancy but warm. Elena talked about her classes, a scholarship application she was working on. Grace listened, asking questions, pretending her mind wasn't churning through scenarios of unemployment and eviction and the careful house of cards that was their life collapsing because she dared to claim space for herself. After Eleanor went to bed, Grace sat at the kitchen table. Through the thin walls, she heard Mr. Patterson's television, Mrs. Rodriguez's baby crying, the ambient symphony of people living too close together because it was all they could afford. She thought about Margaret Hartfield's offer. Whatever it was, it came from someone with resources and connections. Grace had learned long ago that rich people didn't offer help without expecting something in return. The question was what Margaret wanted, and whether Grace could afford to pay it. She thought about Susan's summons. 9 a.m., an hour when most catering staff hadn't even started their shifts. Private, professional, almost certainly termination. She thought about Christopher Blackwell's fury, barely controlled behind that polished facade. Men like him didn't forget humiliation. The threatening text might be just the beginning. Grace pulled out the $500, spreading the bills across the table. Rent was due in 3 days. This would cover it barely, with enough left over for Elena's school registration. One problem solved, thousands more waiting. Her grandmother's voice echoed. Mija, sometimes you have to dance even when you're afraid. Especially when you're afraid. That's when the dance matters most. Grace had been afraid tonight, terrified, but she'd danced anyway. And for those minutes, she'd remembered who she used to be, who she might still be if the world gave people like her second chances, instead of just more bills and less dignity. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Grace almost ignored it, but something made her look. Miguel. Grace, heads up. Christopher Blackwell called the club manager tonight. Demanded you be fired. Manager's trying to decide if the publicity is worth keeping you or if protecting Blackwell's donations matters more. Susan's going to make the call tomorrow. Thought you should know. Also, you were incredible tonight. Worth watching. Whatever happens next. Grace read the message 3 times, so it was already decided, really. Susan would fire her. The club would release some statement about maintaining professional standards. Christopher would continue demolishing 5th Street. Life would go on for everyone except the people whose lives got demolished along with the buildings. Except. Grace looked at her phone again, at the cascade of notifications that hadn't stopped. 2.3 million views had probably grown exponentially. People were watching her story, commenting, sharing, arguing in comment sections. She'd become visible in a way that terrified and thrilled her. Maybe visibility was a weapon. Maybe publicity could protect where power couldn't. Grace opened her social media apps properly for the first time since leaving the club. The number next to her profile made her blink. 47,000 new followers. 47,000 people who'd seen the video, found her account, decided they wanted to follow whatever happened next. Her direct messages were flooded. Most were supportive. Some were bizarre. A few stood out like signals in the noise. From a journalist. Ms. Martinez, I'd love to interview you about tonight's events and the broader issues of service workers' treatment. This story deserves to be told properly. From a dance company director. Grace, your technique is stunning. The passion undeniable. I'd like to discuss opportunities. Please contact me when you're ready. From a legal aid organization. If you're facing retaliation for standing up to wealth inequality, we offer free representation. Know your rights. You're not alone in this fight. And one more, from a username she didn't recognize, but a profile picture showing the gala's ballroom. Grace, I was there tonight. I'm a reporter for the Metro section. What you did was brave. What Christopher Blackwell is doing to Fifth Street affects hundreds of families. I'd like to help tell that story. The real one, not the one his PR team will spin. Interested? Grace stared at that last message for a long moment. Christopher had power, money, connections, lawyers, publicists. But Grace had something he didn't. A story that people cared about. Proof that she wasn't just some invisible worker, but a person with talent, dreams, a daughter, a life that mattered. She thought about Elena, asleep in the next room, working too hard and dreaming too carefully, because she'd learned young that people like them didn't get to dream big. She thought about Mrs. Chen downstairs, facing eviction for the crime of existing in a neighborhood someone had decided was more valuable without her in it. She thought about all the families on Fifth Street whose children would lose their school, their community, their stability, because someone's profit margin demanded it. Sometimes you have to dance, even when you're afraid. Grace's fingers moved across the phone's keyboard before she could talk herself out of it. To the reporter. Yes, I'm interested. Let's talk tomorrow. To the legal aid organization. Thank you. I may need that help sooner than I'd like. To Margaret Hartfield's assistant. I can meet Thursday afternoon. Please let Mrs. Hartfield know I appreciate her reaching out. And then, before she could reconsider, Grace opened her profile and typed a new post. Tonight I danced for $500 at the Riverside Country Club. A millionaire dared me to perform for his entertainment. What you didn't see is why it matters. Christopher Blackwell is planning to demolish Fifth Street, my daughter's school, Mrs. Chen's market, homes for 200-plus families. He wants luxury condos and boutique retail. This is his progress, our displacement for his profit. I'm just one woman who happened to be a dancer before life had other plans. But I'm not invisible anymore, and neither is his plan. Fifth Street matters. Waitress warrior. Grace's thumb hovered. This was the point of no return. Once she posted, she'd be declaring war on one of the city's most powerful developers. Grace hit post. The response was immediate, likes and shares flooding in. Within seconds, dozens shared it. Within minutes, hundreds. She'd just declared war using the only weapons she had, truth and visibility. It was either the bravest or stupidest thing she'd ever done. Grace turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Her mind churned through possibilities, consequences, the ways this could go wrong. But when sleep finally came, she dreamed of dancing. Not for money or survival, but for pure joy. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse with windows overlooking the neighborhoods he planned to transform, Christopher Blackwell was probably not sleeping either. Reading her posts, watching his narrative slip away, planning his response, calculating revenge. The difference was, Grace had nothing left to lose. She'd already lost so much, her career, her dreams, 15 years to survival instead of living. But another voice, her grandmother's, Elena's, her own, after years of silence, whispered back, "Let him try. Let the whole world watch him do it." That's when Grace understood. Visibility wasn't just a weapon, it was armor. As long as people were watching, as long as her story mattered, she had power Christopher's money couldn't buy. She just had to be brave enough to wield it. Susan's office smelled like stale coffee and desperation. Grace arrived 10 minutes early. Other staff members hurried past, their eyes sliding away from hers. Word had spread. At 9 o'clock, Susan opened the door. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from being caught between conscience and self-preservation. "Grace, come in." Susan didn't sit behind her desk. That would have been too formal. Instead, she perched on the edge, hands clasped. "I'll skip the pleasantries. We both know why you're here." Grace nodded. "The club's board met last night. Christopher Blackwell made it clear that his continued patronage depends on your immediate termination." "I see. Grace, what you did Saturday night—" Susan paused. "It was extraordinary. I've worked in hospitality for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. But I have a mortgage, 3 kids in college, a staff of 40 people who depend on their paychecks, and Christopher Blackwell's family donates $500,000 annually." Susan's voice cracked. "I'm not proud of this, but I don't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," Grace said softly. "Some just have more expensive choices than others. Susan handed her an envelope. 2 weeks severance. Your health insurance continues through the month. And Grace, if you need a reference, call me personally. You're one of the best employees I've ever had. Thank you, Susan. I don't blame you. You should. Susan's composure cracked. We all saw how he treated you. And we did nothing because his money matters more than our principles. Grace stood. There was nothing left to say. She walked out of Susan's office, down the hallway where she'd walked thousands of times, past the ballroom where 2 nights ago she'd reclaimed pieces of herself she thought were lost forever. Miguel caught her at the employee entrance. He pressed something into her hand, a folded piece of paper. Everyone on staff chipped in, he said quickly. It's not much, but Grace unfolded the paper. 47 signatures surrounded a message. You danced for all of us. Thank you for showing them we matter. Clipped to the paper was $380 in small bills. Her vision blurred. Miguel, I can't. You can. You did what none of us had the courage to do. He squeezed her shoulder. And Grace, that video hit 7 million views this morning. Your post about 5th Street has been shared over 100,000 times. Whatever Blackwell thought he was doing by getting you fired, he just made you more visible. Grace walked out into morning sunlight that felt too bright, too normal for a day when her careful stability had just collapsed. She had 2 weeks severance, $380 from people who probably couldn't afford to give it, and approximately 3 months before Elena's college applications were due. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Grace almost ignored it, but something made her answer. Ms. Martinez, this is Catherine Ross, Mrs. Hartfield's assistant. Mrs. Hartfield wondered if you might be available for lunch today instead of Thursday. She's been following the developments and feels time is of the essence. Grace thought about her empty calendar, her suddenly wide-open schedule. Today works. Excellent. Riverside Grill at 1 o'clock. Mrs. Hartfield will meet you there. The Riverside Grill was the kind of restaurant where Grace had never eaten, only served. Margaret Hartfield was already seated, reading glasses perched on her nose. Grace, thank you for coming on such short notice. Margaret gestured to the chair. I took the liberty of ordering tea. Grace sat, feeling off balance. I imagine you've had a difficult morning, Margaret said. I was fired, but you probably knew that. I did. Christopher's spinning quite a narrative. Ungrateful employee embarrassing a generous benefactor. Margaret's tone made clear what she thought of that. I've known Christopher since he was a self-important teenager who inherited more money than sense. Why did you want to meet with me? Because Saturday night was about more than a dance. It was about visibility, dignity, how we treat people we consider beneath us. Margaret leaned forward. I've spent 40 years in philanthropy. But lately I've been asking if I've been treating symptoms while ignoring the disease. The disease? Inequality. The fundamental disrespect that allows men like Christopher to thrive. He's demolishing 5th Street and he'll be celebrated for it. Called a visionary, Margaret's voice carried quiet fury. Meanwhile, those families will scatter, losing community, stability, everything that makes a neighborhood a home. So what can we do? I'm unemployed. I have no power. You have 7 million people who watched you dance, 100,000 who shared your story. You have visibility, Grace. That's power Christopher can't buy. Margaret set down her teacup. I'd like to help. Not with charity, but with resources, connections, strategy. I know people at City Council, journalists who cover development, legal experts who fought displacement. Why? Margaret smiled, sadness in it. Because 35 years ago, I was engaged to a man like Christopher, wealthy, connected, convinced of his superiority. I watched him berate a waiter for bringing wrong wine. The cruelty, the pleasure he took in humiliating someone who couldn't fight back. She paused. I broke the engagement. My family was furious, but I couldn't spend my life with someone who treated people as props. For the next hour, Margaret walked Grace through documents about the Riverside project, environmental concerns, rushed community impact studies, questionable zoning variances. If the right people asked the right questions, Margaret said, this project could be delayed, possibly stopped. But it requires pressure. And you think I can provide that? You already are. Your post started conversations. Local news picked it up. There's a community meeting tomorrow, the first time 5th Street residents have organized. Margaret met Grace's eyes. You did that. Grace's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. A message from Elena. Mom, Channel 7 just called. They want to interview you about the club in 5th Street. What should I tell them? Margaret noticed Grace's expression. News media? Local channel wants an interview. Say yes. Margaret's response was immediate. Every interview, every article, every share on social media, it all builds pressure. Makes it harder for Christopher to dismiss you as a disgruntled employee. Makes it impossible for city officials to ignore what's happening on 5th Street. Grace thought about Susan's tired face, about the choice between conscience and survival. She thought about her own empty calendar, her daughter's college applications, the precarious edge they'd always lived on that had just gotten sharper. But she also thought about Mrs. Chen, about the families who'd lose their homes, about Elena watching her mother choose silence over resistance. Okay, Grace said quietly. I'll do the interview. Margaret smiled, genuine warmth mixed with something fierce. Good. Now let's talk strategy. If we're going to fight Christopher Blackwell, we need to be smart about it. He'll retaliate. He's probably already planning it. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Grace's phone buzzed again. This time, the message made her blood run cold. It was from an unknown number, but the attached image was clear. Elena, walking home from school, clearly photographed without her knowledge. The message below read, Pretty daughter. It would be a shame if her college prospects were compromised. Perhaps you should reconsider your public statements, Ms. Martinez. Grace's hands shook. She showed the phone to Margaret, whose expression hardened. That's a direct threat. We're calling the police immediately. And tell them what? That I upset a rich man and now someone sent me a photo? Christopher's name isn't on this message. There's no direct threat, just implication. It's enough for a police report. Paper trail. Margaret pulled out her own phone. And I'm calling a colleague, criminal defense attorney who specializes in harassment cases. She'll know exactly how to document this. Margaret, Grace, listen to me. This is how men like Christopher operate. They push boundaries, test to see if fear will silence you. If you back down now, you're teaching him that threats work. More importantly, you're teaching Elena that power always wins. Grace looked at the photo again. Elena's face, unaware of being watched. Her daughter dragged into this fight because Grace had dared to be visible. But then she thought about Elena's words the night before. Whatever happens next, that moment was worth it. I saw your face. You were alive. Grace made her decision. Call your attorney friend, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. And let's schedule that interview for tomorrow. I want to talk about 5th Street, about Christopher Blackwell, and about what happens when powerful people threaten families for the crime of asking for dignity. Margaret's expression shifted, respect mixed with concern. You understand this will get worse before it gets better? I understand that I'm tired of getting worse being the only option. Maybe it's time to fight for better, even if it's hard, even if it's dangerous. Grace thought about dancing on that ballroom floor, about 15 years of making herself smaller, about Elena growing up in a world that taught her to accept whatever crumbs fell from wealthy tables. Especially then. They spent another hour planning. Margaret made calls, to her attorney friend, to a journalist she trusted, to a city councilwoman who'd been vocal about predatory development. Grace watched this elegant woman weaponize her privilege on behalf of people she'd never met, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive kind. Not the expectation that everything would work out fine. But the hard, defiant kind of hope that acknowledged how steep the climb was and decided to climb anyway. When they finally left the restaurant, the afternoon sun had softened into something gentler. Margaret squeezed Grace's arm. You're not alone in this fight. Remember that. Grace walked to the bus stop, her mind churning. In her pocket was Margaret's business card, call anytime, day or night, a police report number, and the name of an attorney who'd agreed to take her case pro bono. She also had a daughter who might be in danger because of her mother's choices. Grace pulled out her phone and called Elena. Mom, did you see the news? Channel 7 already posted about you. The hashtag is trending. Mija, I need you to listen carefully. Someone sent me a photo of you. I've reported it to the police, but until we know more, I want you to be aware of your surroundings. Walk with friends. Stay in public places. Elena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was harder than 17 should sound. He's trying to scare you. He's succeeding. Good. That means you're winning. People don't threaten you when you're not a threat to them. Elena's certainty was absolute. Mom, whatever you decide, I support you. But please don't stop fighting because you're afraid for me. I'm more afraid of living in a world where people like him always win. Grace closed her eyes, pride and terror warring in her chest. When did you get so brave? I learned from watching you. Even when you thought you were being small, you were teaching me how to be strong. They talked for a few more minutes. Logistics, safety protocols, promises to check in regularly. When Grace hung up, she felt the weight of her choices settling over her shoulders. Not crushing exactly, but present. Real. Her phone buzzed again. The Channel 7 producer, confirming tomorrow's interview. A message from the legal aid organization ready to help. 3 more interview requests from different media outlets. And 1 message from a number that made her pause. Christopher Blackwell himself. Ms. Martinez, I hope you've enjoyed your moment in the spotlight. But moments pass. Consequences remain. You have 24 hours to recant your statements about the Riverside Project and issue a public apology. Otherwise, I'll be forced to pursue legal action for defamation, harassment, and slander. I have the best lawyers money can buy. Do you? Grace read the message twice. Then she screenshotted, forwarded it to Margaret and the attorney, and deleted it. She did have lawyers now. Maybe not the best money could buy, but the best justice could attract. People who believed that power shouldn't always win. Grace boarded the bus home, watching the city slide past her window. Somewhere in this city, Christopher Blackwell was in his office, confident that threats and lawsuits would silence her. He was about to learn that visibility was armor, and Grace Martinez had just put on the full suit. The war had officially begun. The Channel 7 interview aired at 6 o'clock, prime time for local news. Grace sat in her living room with Elena, watching herself on screen. A woman who looked braver than she felt, talking about Fifth Street and displacement and the cost of calling out power. The interviewer, Rachel Chen, didn't soften the questions. Ms. Martinez, Christopher Blackwell's attorneys released a statement calling your allegations defamatory. They claim the Riverside Project underwent proper review and will benefit the community. Your response? Grace on screen leaned forward. I'm sure it will benefit someone's community, just not the community that's lived there for generations. Not Mrs. Chen, who's run her market for 30 years. Not the families whose children walk to school on Fifth Street. Mr. Blackwell's definition of benefit seems to only include people who can afford luxury condos. He's threatening legal action against you. He's threatened a lot of things. Photos of my daughter, my job, which he already took. But here's what he can't take. The truth. And the truth is that hundreds of families are about to lose their homes so he can add another development to his portfolio. Elena squeezed Grace's hand as they watched. Mom, you're amazing. I'm terrified. You can be both. Grace's phone had been ringing non-stop since the interview aired. More media requests. Messages of support from strangers across the country. People sharing their own stories of displacement, of being made invisible by development that served everyone except the people already living there. 3 voicemails from Christopher's attorneys, each more threatening than the last. And 1 message from Margaret. Community meeting tonight at 7 Fifth Street Recreation Center. Your presence would mean everything. These people need to see that fighting back is possible. Grace stood, her decision already made before she consciously thought about it. Get your jacket, Mija. We're going out. Where? To see what happens when invisible people decide to be seen. The Fifth Street Recreation Center was packed. Every chair occupied. People along the walls, spilling into the hallway. Mrs. Chen in front, Mr. Patterson, families from the neighborhood, living their lives in the community Christopher Blackwell had decided wasn't valuable enough to preserve. The meeting started with statistics. 200 families, 83 businesses, 1 school serving 400 children. The Riverside Project would demolish all of it, with relocation assistance that amounted to 3 months' rent. A man in his 60s stood. I was born 3 blocks from here. Where am I supposed to go at my age? A young mother. My daughter's special education program is here. The nearest equivalent is an hour away. Mrs. Chen. My customers are my family. You relocate that? You destroy that. Then someone shouted, Grace Martinez is here. Heads turned. Margaret appeared at Grace's elbow. "They want to hear from you." Grace made her way forward, legs unsteady. "I don't have solutions," Grace began. "I'm not a lawyer or activist. I'm just someone who's spent 15 years being invisible to people with power. Being told my work matters, but my life doesn't." Heads nodded. "Saturday night, a man dared me to dance for his entertainment. What he didn't know was that he was giving me permission to remember who I used to be. Before I learned to make myself small." Grace's voice grew stronger. 7 million people watched me dance. 100,000 shared my story. We're not invisible anymore." "But what does that change?" someone called. "He still has permits, lawyers, money. He doesn't have what we have, the truth, and people who care. His project has environmental violations, rushed permits. None of that mattered when nobody was watching. But people are watching now." She looked around the room. "Let them see you. Tell your stories. Show up at city council. Talk to reporters. Let the city see what Christopher Blackwell wants to erase. This is our lives, our community, our right to exist." The room erupted. Not applause. Something raw. Recognition. Grace was heading out when a commotion erupted near the entrance. Christopher Blackwell strode in, flanked by 2 attorneys in expensive suits. The crowd's energy shifted immediately, conversations dying mid-sentence. Christopher's eyes found Grace. "Ms. Martinez, how convenient. You've saved me the trouble of serving you papers personally." An attorney held out an envelope. Grace took it with steady hands. "Defamation suit for false statements made during your interview. $10 million in damages." The room went silent. $10 million. The number was absurd, impossible, designed to terrify rather than compensate. Grace scanned the first page of legalese, then looked up. Something her grandmother once said floated through her mind. "Men who are winning don't need to convince everyone they're winning. You came here yourself, to a community meeting, to hand-deliver a lawsuit." "That's interesting." Christopher's expression tightened. "I wanted to make sure you understood the seriousness of your situation." "I understand it perfectly. You're scared." Grace took a step toward him. 10 million people have now seen me dance. Your threatening texts, your attempts to get me fired, your intimidation, it's all over social media. Every move you make, someone's watching, and you hate it. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I'm dealing with a man so used to power he can't handle being questioned. A man who threatens teenagers because their mothers won't stay quiet." Grace glanced at the lawsuit. $10 million for telling the truth about public records anyone can access. You're not suing because you'll win. You're suing to bleed me dry in legal fees, to make an example of me. Christopher's smile was cold. "Glad you understand. But here's what you don't understand." Grace held up the papers. "I filed a police report about your harassment. My attorney, yes, I have one now, has documented every threat. And this lawsuit, you just gave me discovery rights, which means I get to subpoena your communications, your project files, all the corners you cut getting those permits approved." Christopher's smile faltered slightly. Margaret materialized beside Grace. "Christopher, I didn't know you'd be joining us. How thoughtful to drive all the way to 5th Street. The same 5th Street you've been calling urban blight in your investor presentations. Funny how different it looks when you're actually standing in it, surrounded by the people who live here. Margaret, I should have known you'd be involved in this circus." "Circus?" Margaret glanced around. "These are citizens exercising their rights. Though I suppose democracy looks like a circus when it doesn't go your way." A reporter pushed forward, camera rolling. "Mr. Blackwell, can you comment on allegations that environmental reviews were incomplete?" Christopher's jaw clenched. "No comment. My attorneys will handle all press inquiries." He turned back to Grace, voice dropping to a furious whisper. "You've made a powerful enemy." "No," Grace said softly. "You made an enemy of the wrong person. Someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Someone who learned that being small doesn't keep you safe. It just makes you easier to step on." For a moment, they stood measuring each other. Christopher Blackwell, who'd spent his life winning because money made winning easy. Grace Martinez, who'd spent her life surviving because survival was the only option she'd been given. Then Christopher turned and walked out, his attorneys trailing behind. The door swung shut, and the room erupted into conversation. Mrs. Chen appeared at Grace's side. "You just got sued by a millionaire." "I know. You scared?" "Terrified." Mrs. Chen patted her arm. "Good. Means you're not stupid, but look around." She gestured at the packed room, at people who minutes ago had been strangers now exchanging phone numbers, forming alliances. "You woke something up tonight, not just in them, in yourself." Grace looked at the lawsuit papers still clutched in her hand. $10 million. A number meant to destroy her. And maybe it would. Maybe Christopher's lawyers would grind her down in depositions and motions. Maybe she'd lose everything. But for the first time in 15 years, Grace didn't feel invisible. The weeks that followed were a blur. The environmental violations in Christopher's permits turned out to be substantial. Protected wetlands classified as low impact based on outdated surveys. The rushed community impact study had omitted interviews with actual community members. 3 city council members who'd approved the project had received campaign contributions from Christopher's development company the same week they voted. The local news coverage turned into regional coverage, then national. Dancing Waitress Takes on Millionaire developer played well on morning shows. Grace gave more interviews, each one easier than the last. Elena appeared in several, articulate and fierce, talking about what it meant to watch her mother fight instead of fold. Christopher's lawsuit stalled in discovery. His attorneys filed motions, requesting delays. Margaret's attorney friend, who'd taken Grace's case pro bono and seemed to relish every moment, filed counter motions, requesting documentation Christopher clearly didn't want to provide. The Riverside project didn't get canceled. That would have been too neat, too simple. Real life rarely offered perfect victories, but the city council called for a comprehensive review. Environmental groups filed injunctions. The timeline stretched from 18 months to 3 years, then 5. Permits expired and needed renewal, which meant new hearings, new opportunities for public comment. Christopher tried to maintain control of the narrative, but his perfect image had cracks now. A former employee came forward about toxic workplace practices. An ex-wife granted an interview about financial manipulation during their divorce. The facade of the benevolent developer crumbled under scrutiny. 6 months later, Grace stood in a small dance studio. Morning sunlight illuminated a dozen women, former dancers returning, others trying for the first time, inspired by a woman who'd claimed space in a server's uniform. Grace demonstrated a tango step. The studio wasn't hers. She rented it 3 mornings a week. Classes barely covered rent. She still worked catering, still worried about bills. But she danced. She taught others to take up space. Elena appeared, waving her phone. "Mom, full tuition scholarship. They said my essay about witnessing courage was the strongest they'd read." Grace pulled her close. "Mija, I'm so proud. I learned from the best. Mrs. Chen's grant came through too. She's renovating, staying put. The Riverside project was still happening, just slowly, with modifications. Some families relocated, others stayed. Not perfect, but shaped by visibility and refusal to accept erasure without resistance." Grace looked at her students. They were here because she'd shown them reclaiming yourself was possible. "Let's run through that sequence again. Remember, you're not apologizing for taking up space. You're celebrating that you exist." As music filled the studio, Grace caught her reflection. She saw lines, gray hair, a body marked by years of hard work, but also a woman who looked back without apology. That night, Grace sat with Elena at their small kitchen table, reviewing college acceptance letters and financial aid packages. Her daughter would go to university. Mrs. Chen would keep her store. 5th Street would endure, changed but not erased. And Christopher Blackwell? He'd moved on to other projects in other neighborhoods. His lawsuit quietly dropped after discovery revealed communications he didn't want made public. He'd lost this battle but remained wealthy, powerful, largely untouched by consequences. That part bothered Elena. It's not fair. He should have lost everything, the way he tried to take everything from us. Grace considered her daughter's words carefully. "Maybe, but I learned something these past months, Mija. Winning isn't always about destroying your enemy. Sometimes it's about refusing to be destroyed. Christopher still has his money, his power, but I have something he'll never have. I know who I am when everything else is stripped away. I know what I'm willing to fight for. Is that enough? It has to be. Because the alternative is invisibility, and invisibility is its own kind of destruction." Grace reached across the table, taking Elena's hand. When I danced at that gala, I wasn't thinking about changing the world. I was just tired of disappearing. But you know what happened? Other people who'd been disappearing saw me, and they remembered they didn't have to accept erasure either. That's not a perfect victory, but it's real. And sometimes real is more valuable than perfect. Elena squeezed her mother's hand. You changed, though. You're different now. I remembered who I was before the world taught me to be small. That's not the same as changing. It's more like coming home. Grace smiled. And you, Mija, you never have to learn to be small in the first place. That's the real victory. Not that I beat Christopher Blackwell, but that you get to grow up knowing that fighting back is possible, that your voice matters, that you don't have to accept invisibility just because someone with power decides you should disappear. Later, Grace stood at her window over 5th Street. Tomorrow, she'd teach another class. Next week, another council meeting. The work never ended. Bills came. Survival was hard. But Grace Martinez was no longer invisible. She remembered her grandmother. Dancing isn't about the audience, Mija. It's about remembering your body knows joy, and once you remember, no one can take that away. Grace had danced for $500, but what she'd gained was priceless, the knowledge that she mattered. And in a world that taught people like her to disappear, that knowledge was the most revolutionary act of all.